Okay. In your lifetime, did you see any aspects of slavery that still existed? Were there any jobs where involuntary servitude took place?
I haven't in my lifetime, because of the law, because of the amendments. What I see more are, as time goes on, it's people taking jobs that they have to survive.
Mm-hmm.
But again, it's not servitude. It's not being considered property. You know, the individual's not being considered property that you're buying and selling and
Right.
sort of at their mercy. So I don't see that. I think you see that very infrequently in this country. Other countries, yes. You know, the slave trade, young girls being sold into prostitution. I mean, that to me would be pretty close, about as close as you can get. But I haven't personally experienced that.
Gotcha. Unfree labor could even be when an employee is blackmailed, physically threatened, or threatening to cause financial harm. Do you think these are more relevant types of slavery?
Yes, and I'm not sure I'd call it slavery. I look at that as resulting from laws that have been passed to ensure the sanctity of the amendments. So the amendment is the overriding federal guideline that states and the feds have to abide by.
Gotcha.
In order to enforce that, subsequent laws have been passed. Avoiding, it's illegal for employees to experience harassment on the job. And then to define harassment has varied over the years. So that if it's an uncomfortable work environment for many reasons,
Mm-hmm.
that could be illegal.
Yeah.
And you said, there was part of your question again about, what was part of it? Say that again.
Unfree labor could even be when an employee is blackmailed, physically threatened, or threatens to cause financial harm.
Unfair labor. I like that phrase. Isn't that what your phrase?
Unfree.
Unfree. Or I saying unfair? Unfree. Yes, and I think a lot of times we're you feel like you really have sold your soul to the devil in many ways to stay at a job because you don't have recourse.
Right.
The employee doesn't have the recourse to speak up, to leave for any number of reasons. So those issues surround us everywhere. Unfair labor practices, unfair wage practices. Again, all of that has to be legislated at the local level to ensure that that federal bar is met. And that's what I find fascinating. At the local level, yes, we can ensure a workplace that's free from those kinds of things.
Right.
That's what is so interesting. The amendments are there, we don't pay much attention to them, and yeah. But in everyday life, it's the other underlying rules and regulations that are really upholding all of that for us. And I think critically important.
For the 14th Amendment, the Equal Protection Clause requires each state to provide equal protection to each citizen, including racial segregation and gender discrimination. What are your general thoughts, and do you see it applied, especially with women in the workforce and the glass ceiling?
Yes, I mean, I think we see racial discrimination everywhere we go, religious discrimination all around us. I think we see gender discrimination everywhere there is. Wage. Are women earning the same wage as men? And I think 95% of the time the answer is no. That's anecdotal in my own personal opinion. But I very rarely see equity there. Gender discrimination, I think women still today work harder to prove their worth and their merit in professional school admissions. An example, medical schools, you read articles that medical schools really have admitted more than 50% of their incoming class is female. And yet, 2/3 of women in the medical field will leave the medical profession.
I didn't know that.
Same with law. And why is that? Well, balancing everything in this day and age is very difficult. And so very often you'll see a lot of discrimination on the job as a result of that, saying, well, are you going to stay in the job market or not? Are you going to practice law forever or not? Are you going to be a practicing physician or not? Should we take a chance? Now, is it spoken these days? Probably not. Is it there? Probably. That would be my guess. Religious discrimination, you see more, I think, as a result of 9/11, that people are assuming they know all about a certain religion and it may not be true. And clearly that's been demonstrated since 2001. So it exists. I think lack of education is the primary reason for that. Racial discrimination, I think it's really hard to move above and beyond that. I think there's so many reasons for it. I think education is at the heart of it all. That's not this issue. But
Okay, what do you think about the due process clause, which includes the right to life, liberty, and property? Do you feel that our local and state governments follow through with these promises?
I do. And it may be that that's one of the areas that due process is easier to understand and implement. I'm not sure, but it could be. It's sort of clearer.
Mm-hmm.
Due process of law. Right to a jury trial, right to a court-appointed attorney, right to a swift hearing, right in eminent domain situations, right to compensation if they're taking your property. It's all pretty objective and more clear-cut, I think, than some of the other issues when it gets to civil rights and subjective reactions to people based on what they look like or what they say. So I really do think that due process exists. I think everyone has a right to file a lawsuit. Economic discrepancies may keep people from doing it, but still I think it's easier to implement than the others.
Another big act was the Higher Education Act, Title IX. This prohibited discrimination based on gender by universities, colleges receiving federal aid. What are your general thoughts on this?
Yeah, I think the overlying principle is really valid. You want to make sure that people have access to higher education regardless of gender, because that's a federal law, and if states are being schools are being supported by the federal government, they need to abide by those expectations too. And I think it's really important. I think it was really the key that opened the door for women in many areas. I went to law school back in the 70s. If I hadn't been female, chances are I probably wouldn't have gotten in. That's my own take on it. My scores were okay, but not stellar to get into professional school. However, they need a certain number of women, or percentage. So you're right on the cusp. So if I'm there competing against the male candidate and they need women, I'll get in. Really interesting that it works in your favor. I think that's an interesting dichotomy, especially when it happens to you.
Yeah.
So is it right? Is it fair?
Yeah, I'm not sure if it's
Does the
fair,
outcome outweigh that level of unfairness? I think when you look at, what was it, California, law school admissions, trying to determine who to admit and who not to based with those issues, and rather than going just on scores and application, it becomes, well, we need this population, we need that population represented. Is it fair? How do you step up the number of opportunities? It's not the right way to say it. If you want your society to represent society, so you want professionals that reflect the makeup of your society. It's not all white male, but it reflects everybody in your pop. How do you guarantee that? When you've got people applying that may not have had the same level of qualifications and the same test scores based on discrepancies in their, not discrepancies, but weaknesses in their educational preparation. And how do you give them at least a chance to get through? I mean, that's a hard ethical question to answer. And so these percentages, these I don't want to call them entitlements, but things like Title IX, to open the doors a little bit, to give different groups a chance. Is it a good thing or not? I mean, you can sit and argue it yes and no forever. And women in athletics, same thing. Should there be girls' sports, and should women be admitted into universities to increase the number of women in athletics? I mean, that's a debatable issue that you could debate until forever. But if it's you, it takes on a whole different character. That's the hard part, to separate you out of all the issues.
Okay. The 15th Amendment was designed to prohibit discrimination against voters on the basis of race or servitude. Poll taxes were created to keep lower income African Americans from voting. How do you feel about this, and can you think of any modern day instances like these?
Yeah, I think basically it's denying access based on being able to pay. You know, you pay, you go. And if you can't pay, you don't go. And that's what they were doing with the voting. Women couldn't vote because they didn't own property, because their husbands owned the property, so they couldn't vote. Well, that changed, thank goodness. But why would owning property give you the right to vote or not?
Mm-hmm.
It's like,
Yeah,
why would that matter? If we're all citizens, does it matter if you own property? So, fortunately, that's not a factor anymore. Same with being able to vote, to pay to vote. Why should you have to pay to vote? What's the connection? And was it a way just to keep people out that you didn't want their opinions, or that you didn't think were as good as you?
Right.
And that's probably what started from. So, I think access to voting, it's a federal right for all citizens. I don't see it. We don't see it anymore. I hope it doesn't exist anymore. Hopefully there are polling places everywhere, so you don't have to, if you don't have the money to get there, how do you get there? You don't have a car, how do you get there? There's no public transportation, how do you get there? Without polling places being everywhere, or with polling places being removed, I would argue that institutes a type of poll tax in a broader sense, because you're denying access because people don't have the money to get on the trolley to go vote.
Yeah, that's a good point.
You know, equal access is across the board. So if you have to walk, there's got to be polling places where you can go. And so you think of the schools. Okay, so they're in the public schools, and we live out here in the suburbs. Should there be free transportation to get you to the polls? And that's what a lot of townships do, is they'll go pick up senior citizens to get them to the polls. So all of that ties into this concept of everybody has a right to vote. Well, that's interesting. Oh. So when do we vote online? You know, interesting. Or through TV, you can get movies through Netflix now.
Yeah.
On your TV, and through your Wii, and through your Xbox 360. Are we gonna be able to vote that way too? Okay, now there's a conversation.
Okay.
But I couldn't afford an Xbox 360, so I wouldn't be able to vote.
In general, the Civil War pitted the North and South against each other because the North wanted slavery abolished while the South did not. Do you still see a gap between Northerners and Southerners today?
Yes. I think you have two different sets of beliefs that have just been so ingrained for how many hundreds of years. And the Southerners, we don't know the Northerners don't know the Southerners. We haven't walked in the same shoes. So it doesn't surprise me that the South feel one way about Northerners, and we feel one way perhaps about Southerners. Confederate flag was flown in South Carolina way up into the late 90s, I believe. Pretty sure it was at least that late. And the Southerners, those that live in the South, were taught about the Civil Wars, the War of Northern Aggression. So we're teaching our own people different interpretations of the same event.
Mm-hmm.
And you wonder how much of our history books are written with different biases and opinions. So that's interesting. So it wouldn't surprise me if there's a divergence of opinions. But in reality, I don't think anybody in this country would deny that slavery is just wrong.
Mm-hmm.
So I don't think that would ever divide this country. Something like that I don't think would still exist. I just think you have different cultural outlooks and different experiences so you have different viewpoints or ways of looking at things. And maybe from the East and the West too. You know, like those people that went West were very daring and adventuresome and independent, very liberal. Thus, California has a tendency to be a very liberal state, so things are passed there, laws are passed there in that state before they might be in a very conservative state on the East Coast. Very interesting.
Okay. Yeah, that's all our questions.
Oh, darn, I'm getting off track.
Thank you so much.
All right. Thanks, you guys.